Have you had to deal with corruption in your industry, maybe even in your company? There are things you can do as a leader to prevent it, and today's episode will give you insight on how. This is Coaching for Leaders, episode 277.
Produced by Innovate Learning, maximizing human potential.
Greetings to you from Orange County, California. This is Coaching for Leaders, and I'm your host, Dave Stachowiak. Leaders aren't born, they're made. And this weekly show gives you access to the practical wisdom that will empower you to become a better leader. And as you know, if you've listened to the show for a bit, we have a global audience in the show. And one of the things that I'm always looking for is to bring in more voices that bring perspective from around the globe. And I'm really excited today to welcome our guest who's going to provide us perspective on how to navigate and combat corruption in organizations. And this is going to be, I know, a really illuminating conversation for me. And even if you don't find that this is maybe an issue in your organization or even your industry or the country that your organization is located in, I know that you will inevitably come across this in your dealings with international organizations across the world. And I'm really glad to welcome someone who's an expert in combating corruption, and that is Mariano Mosquera. He is an Edmond J. Safra Network Fellow at Harvard University and a Postdoctoral Fellow of the National University of Cordoba. He is Professor of Ethics and Access to Public Information at the National University of Cordoba and Professor of Public Policy at the Catholic University of Cordoba. He's an expert consultant to the United Nations Development Program in combating corruption, and I'm really glad to have him here today. Mariano, I'm so glad to welcome you to Coaching for Leaders.
Hello, Dave. Thank you. Thank you for inviting me.
Well, the pleasure is mine, and I saw an article recently where you were cited as one of the experts on navigating this issue, and I know that this is something that is very different in different parts of the world, but before we get into some of the details, I'm wondering if you could just help us to define what corruption is.
Well, it's not an easy question, because what you say before, that we have many perspectives around the world about what is corruption. But I like to, and I prefer definitions of corruption that focus on a structural perspective, on institutional perspectives. So I think that a good definition of corruption is the consequence of a not legitimate influence that weakens the efficacy of an institution. That is a good definition, I think, because we have many assumptions that we can question and we can say that are not really true with this kind of definition. So I think that we have focused on a definition of institutional corruption, not on personal corruption, and a definition that we have to focus on a definition that talk about legitimate and not legally corruption. So maybe that's an interesting focus. But of course, we have many different perspectives around the world. For example, in Latin American countries, we have more perspective focus on public officials corruption. In other parts of the world, for example, the United States, you have a more open definition about corruption in private sector, for example.
Indeed, and I'm glad you mentioned it from an organizational or even institutional framework, because that is really it's really powerful. And as the listeners of our show know, and we've talked about on the show many times, it is very difficult to change something that is institutionalized within an organization or even an industry. And just so we get a sense of, I know almost all of us have certainly heard the word corruption, and we're in some ways familiar with it, but I'm wondering if you could help us just by maybe sharing an example of something that you've seen recently that really shows that institutional kind of corruption.
Well, for example, in Latin America and in many countries in Latin America, I have working a lot on Chile, Peru, of course, Argentina, and we have many problems, for example, with public procurement process. In public procurement process between the state, between the government and the supplier, and between the company that has to provide some goods to the state. We have many rules that are bad rules, bad laws in the public procurement process, and we have some corruption that is legal, but that is corruption inside the rules. For example, collusion examples that, for example, some providers, some suppliers of the state that has an agreement to do some fraud against the states. That is very common in Latin American countries. And for example, we have so many cases in the recent years here in Argentina or in Chile, Peru, and this is a new perspective here for us, because we always talk about corruption in our agenda, in our public agenda in Latin American countries, focus on public officials. But now we understand that we have a lot of problems in our rules and our laws.
Yeah, and I was interested in reviewing some of your writing that there's also very different methods of corruption. It's doesn't just show up one way. Tell us about some of the different methods that you've uncovered in your research that would be helpful for us to understand and to appreciate the scope of corruption.
Well, of course, yes. We have many methods that involves many actors in practice of corruption. For example, it's very common the traffic of influence, when two actors can involve in this practice. And for example, some company make a lobby to do a corrupt practice against the states, for example, against the government. Traffic of influence is a very big problem here in Latin American countries, because it may be in a lot of cases it's a legal practice. We don't have laws against traffic of influence. So that is a very good example of a problem of institutional corruption. Then we have the association with suppliers, like another problem that we have in a corruption practice. Clientelism in Latin American countries, of course, is a big problem. It's a big problem too. And then we have more political problems and corruption problems associated directly to the traditional conception of corruption focused on public official, like political hiring or the sales of office that involves monetary compensation for the appointment to a public office. And it's a problem that connects many actors with that problem. But I think that the big issue about the different methods is try to make a difference between legal methods and illegal methods, and try to understand that maybe some legal methods are institutional corruption too. That's, I think, is the big issue that we have to discuss in Latin America.
We have done some shows in the recent past on the importance and the perspective around power in organizations, and I've certainly heard many times about the critical nature that information plays as far as power and influence in an organization. And one of the things I noticed in your work is that you talk about the importance that information plays in corruption. And I was wondering if you could help us to understand how individual parties having access to information plays a role in that.
Yes, of course, it's so important issue. Of course, I think that transparency and access to information can be a good key role to play in the fight against corruption. For many years, we have some rules here in Latin America about laws of access to public information. But of course, the most important revolution in the topic is about open data perspectives. Now in our governments, we have even more governments that have open governments platforms, that have open data in the websites. And I think that this is the most the important role that are playing, for example, technologies to trying to fight against corruption. But information, of course, is so important because it's so difficult in corruption practice to fight against corruption after the corrupt practice. Controls and sanctions are not doing a well job in our countries. I think that prevention is something essential to do something good with preventions in the fight against corruption. I think the information, open data, transparency of the contracts, for example, transparency of all the rules and incentives that some institution has is something really important and is a key role in the fight against corruption, Dave.
I resonate a lot with that because I'm just thinking in my own experience and experience with clients over the years is even when an organization is acting very ethically and responsibly, when they don't allow access to information or it's not clear how something was determined or how a decision was made, there is often the assumption that people begin to make that the organization, even if doing the right thing, is perhaps acting in a way that is corrupt and if not corrupt, at least suspect in some way. And so it's really it's fascinating how much information and just awareness and access to that information can really make a difference.
Yes. Information plays a key role, I think, and we have many assumptions about corruption that maybe we have to fight with more information and with more education in the issue of corruption. We have many assumptions that maybe that organizations or persons in organizations believe and strongly believe, and maybe they are not correct for the country, for the sector, or for their own institutions. I think one of these is, for example, the personal corruption. We talk a lot about personal corruption in Latin American countries, about that corruption is a personal problem, and we never talk about the rules and the institutions that have the incentives that promote corruption. That is a big problem because always we have to sanction or to try to catch and then go to jail some person, but never try to do a reform in our institution. That is a big problem. And the other problem is that always we think about corruption in a legal perspective. We always try to think that it's a legal perspective, it's a legal problem. Maybe what is happening today in our organizations is that maybe they have a reputational risks and not just legal risk like they have in the past, Dave.
It's funny, as you were saying that, I was thinking back to maybe my first exposure to corruption or the potential for corruption in an organization. My dad, for many years, still is a greeter, usher in his church. And I remember I helped him as a kid, and I was part of the greeter team too. And whenever the collection was taken at Mass, we would, the rule was, it was always more than one person would go back into the back room and to sort the collection, because you didn't want to give any one person by themselves the incentive to potentially take something from the collection basket. And it was interesting to me. I remember that was kind of my first exposure of like, oh, you don't assume that people act truthfully. And yet the focus was always on the individual. And it was always interesting at the time, even thinking as a child, like, why do you have people go by themselves into a back room to do this? Like, it was the focus on the person versus the institution of like, how do we look at a better process and procedure? And I mean, I know that's maybe an oversimplification, but it is interesting that we do tend to look at bad actors, I think, in a lot of organizations, I know I have, versus looking at the organization as a whole.
Yes, here in, for example, now in Argentina, that we have a change of a government, and of course, always we happens in Argentina. politics cycle, that when a new government came to power in Argentina, of course they have a lot of critics to the last government, to the other government, and if you open a newspaper today in Argentina, you can find a lot of corruption cases, always is centered in some person. The public agenda don't try to explain all the rules and all the incentives that maybe we still have in our institutions, and it's not changing if you change just one person. So we have a big problem with that, because it's a powerful tool. If you try to focus the corruption on a person, and you think that after that person is not anymore in the government, for example, the government don't have anymore that problem of corruption. It's very powerful to put that focus on the public agenda, and of course it's so powerful then when we think about solutions, but because we think that solutions are trying to catch that kind of persons inside organizations, but we never try to understand how that organization works.
Oh, yeah, indeed. And I don't know if this would translate into Spanish, but we have a term, scapegoat, here in English, and it's putting, it's having one person to atone for all the ills of the organization. And like you said, it almost never works. Just because that person is removed from the system, the system itself still has the challenge, the institution as itself. And I hear that message very strongly from you. And I like that a lot, of really looking at where do you make changes in the system versus trying to, yes, people need to be accountable for their actions, but where do we look at the system as far as what did the system do in order to influence that behavior?
Yes, we have the expression. I think that you have in United States too, of the bad apple. That always we try to catch the bad apple, but we never try to focus the problem on the box of the apples, just to try to catch the bad apple. And if you catch that bad apple, the box is okay. We have that kind of expression. And in corruption problems, Dave, that is a big problem, but because now in our present time we focus on like a personal problem every day in our public agenda in Latin America. Is the president, is a minister, is a public official, but we never try to discuss the system, of course.
Yeah, sadly, I think we're actually really similar here in the States, and I think probably a lot of places in the world. And I see this in the news all the time, where there's a scandal in our government or something happens, and someone resigns as a result, and yet the organizational system hasn't really changed very much. And so I think that your point is so well made here, and I think that really transcends culture too. And that actually leads me to my next question. I'm wondering, for someone who is a leader in an organization, and maybe they suspect, and then let's actually look at it through the lens of the institution. They see things that their institution is doing that may be encouraging corruption, or at least not preventing it, like you've spoken of. What are some of the first steps that a leader can do in order to begin some of the prevention?
Well, it's an interesting question, because, for example, something that I say before, that is very important in the practice to fight against corruption, to prevent. That's very important, because if the corruption practice, if you try to fight corruption after the corruption practice is did, it's very difficult to try to change the perspective. And always we focus on try to seek and try to detect the personal responsible, like we say before, in the bad apple perspective. But I think that prevention in the fight against corruption is very possible. I work in many cases in in Latin American countries with many businessmen in Latin American countries. I am professor in many classes. That I'm professor in business administrations, for example, plans or in master administrations as a business. And all my students are businessmen, and they try to explain me about different corruption practice that they live. And I realized that prevention is not so difficult that we think. I think that a businessman knows when they are going to a meeting that they have a high probability that the meeting is going to transform in a corrupt meeting. So I think that the first thing that a businessman can do is try to understand what is the space that they are going to go to a meeting, for example, and when they can anticipate the corruption, the practice of corruption. So if they can anticipate the practice of corruption, they can do a lot of things, because they can, for example, anticipate the corporative policy to the other party, for example, that they, for example, offer a bribe or trying to have a corrupt agreement. They can anticipate the corporative policies. For example, they can use some methods standardized that they can use to discourage the corrupt offer. For example, never going alone to a meeting, for example, that they know that has a high probability to transform in a corrupt meeting. So I think that if you can prevent the corruption practice, always if you can anticipate. I think that this is very important, and I think that it's not so difficult that we can always think that it is. I'm trying to measure that with my students and in all my experience, and I understand now that it's not so difficult to do that, Dave.
I love that advice of taking another party along with. And I'm just thinking back to a conversation I had a few months ago with a friend of mine who is actually utilizing that tactic specifically in an organization here in the States because of some difficult relationships with an organization. And so I think it's really, really smart tactically to do that if you suspect it. And I'm wondering, are there other things that are common things that you find often help when someone, and like you said, a lot of times you have that sixth sense that maybe something is up, or maybe this isn't a person, even if not corruption, maybe it's someone that I don't trust very well. In addition to taking someone else along to the meeting, are there other things you found that are really helpful to people in prevention?
Yes, of course. For example, one of the big problems that we have is that, for example, for businessmen that we are in a corrupt situation, always they think that if they say no to corruption, they are gonna, we call, lose the market. That's the expression that we use here in Latin American. Lose the market is that you are going out of the game of the market. So that is the afraid that always has the businessman to resist to corruption. So always a lot of solutions to prevent, or a lot of solutions to say no to corruption, trying to don't use violent responses to the other party, and try to have, for example, a situation that we can have business in the future, but now we try to discourage the corruption and try to not be a violent, not generate a violent situation. So that is some kind of the dilemma that always have our businessmen in Latin American countries. In that kind of situation, of course, we have some tactics that always businessmen use. For example, explain the corporative processes with more people involved. After a corrupt offer, for example, you can explain that it not depends on you, because you have in your company many processes to comply that involve a lot of people. That is something that businessmen use a lot. Or, for example, delay the situation. Try to don't discuss this topic, trying to talk about other issues. Of course, if you can anticipate that corrupt practice is going to have a success in that kind of meeting. So I think that the most important thing is that you can have a lot of methods, but you have to anticipate that the situation is going to happen. And the other thing that is very important that is that you can explain clearly about the corporative process. I think that there are two main methods that you can use.
Yeah, I find that really a very mature way to look at it, because I think that there are some people who would say, okay, if I got a corrupt offer, I'm just going to stand firm and say no, and maybe even report them in some way to some agency. And that may be appropriate in some situations, but it, like you said, it cuts off the opportunity to influence in the future, and ultimately, I think my sense is for what you really want in your work is to have organizations and entities engage in a dialogue where they still have the opportunity to do business down the road. It's just that we're not going to do it this way. We're not going to do it in this framework. We're going to do it in a way that really honors the way we want to do business. And so is that an accurate assessment of what you're saying?
Exactly, because what you say, that is a mature way to see, because I think that the easy answer, the easy solution is try to say, of course, I have to report that to authorities and try that never happen again. But this is not the real dilemma in our organization and in our institutions. The real dilemma is that we have a lot of practice of corruption that are very deep in our system, in the way our system works and function, and in that kind of dilemma, it's not easy to say no to a corruption practice for a businessman. The businessman think that they are gonna lose the market and they are gonna be out of the game immediately. So the dilemma is trying to change the game, but not trying to doing some violent situation that other actors in the same game doesn't understand in the short term. So I think that's the dilemma, Dave, and this is a real dilemma that institutions and organizations has in Latin American countries. And this is an intelligent way to see the situation. Of course, the easy answer is to report or to go to authorities. But this is not the real dilemma that we have.
Yeah, and I really appreciate the complexity that you hold with that, because and this, of course, is something that varies by situation and around the world. And of course, we're not suggesting that no one should ever go to an authority organization to make a report. But I think it captures the complexity, especially in the part of the world that you work of the complexity of this and how to navigate it well and to affect change and to have the opportunity to influence and affect change. And I also, I really appreciate you mentioning this of just for our listeners who are in other parts of the world, but also who work internationally, of really appreciating a lot of the challenges that businessmen and women around the world are navigating in different countries that they really do need to be very mindful of when doing business. And so I think it's just a fabulous lesson for us as leaders. Speaking of lessons, Mariano, one of the things I often ask our guests is, and make the point, is that leaders are always learning and growing themselves. And I'm wondering what's something that you hold to be true today that you did not recognize or believe 5 years ago.
Yes, I didn't see 5 years ago that the technology is going to be so important that is to date in the fight against corruption. I think technology is changing a lot of ways that we see the problem. For example, something that I said before, reputational risk. Maybe for small business or for small companies or for media businessmen, is really important today. It's really important, and maybe it's more important than legal risk. And this is going to change, of course, our perspective of corruption, because if reputational risk is more important than legal risk, it's not just illegal the corruption in our country. So I think technology is going to change a lot of perspective. Reputational risk, for example, in social networks, is maybe more important now for a company than legal risk or a specific legal risk in some process that they have inside their organization. So I think that the technology is going. We have a great opportunity with technology in the fight against corruption.
Mariano, I really appreciate your perspective, and I know that there is definitely going to be a subset of our audience that will want to learn more about this, and particularly some of our Latin American listeners. For those who would like to reach out to you, find your website and your writing and some of your work, what's the best way for people to connect with you?
Well, with my website, marianomosquera.com is a good option. Of course, I can answer more questions. Of course, my Spanish is better than my English. So for the Latino American audience, in Spanish, I can answer questions about my work.
Well, your English is a lot better than my Spanish, so I'm really grateful for you being on the show, and I'm grateful for you speaking to us in English and sharing your work. I just appreciate the perspective you bring and the complexity of this, but also the perspective you bring in those of us who do work internationally with many different organizations around the world. I think this is such an important perspective to be aware of. So I really appreciate your perspective, Mariano.
Thank you, Dave, for inviting me, and it was a pleasure for me. Thank you.
This is the very last show of 2016. Next show is going to be in 2017, believe it or not. And I have a quick favor to ask of you, especially if you've been listening to this show for a bit of time, or maybe even the entire year 2016. The one thing that I've learned, well, I've learned a lot of things, but one thing I have for sure learned about hosting a leadership podcast over the last 5 to 6 years is that there is a massive amount of interest in leadership podcasts come the first week of January. It happens every year. We get a lot more downloads of the show. We get a lot more email. And it's always so exciting to see new people come into the Coaching for Leaders community, as many of you did, beginning of a year, looking for your own resources on how to develop yourself as a leader. And it makes a big difference this time of year. I'm always grateful for the kind notes and the emails that many of you have sent to me. And also for the ratings and reviews that you have posted on iTunes and the other services. Thank you so much if you have done that in the past. I'm very grateful for it. And if you have been listening to the show for a bit and you haven't done that in the past, not only am I as grateful as I normally am, but this week in particular, it makes a big difference in how many people locate this show come January, and that we're able to serve and to get more recommendations for future guests. It really does help build our community in a substantial way. So if you have a brief moment sometime this week during the holidays to leave a rating or a review for the show, iTunes is the best way to do it. iTunes is still the preeminent place for podcasts and for people to discover podcasts. Even if you don't use iTunes to listen to the show, if you have access to it, if you wouldn't mind taking just a brief moment, it takes about a minute or two to write a review. It takes about 10 seconds to leave a quick star rating on iTunes. It makes a huge difference, and I'd be very grateful if you take a moment to do that sometime this week. If you have an iPhone or an iPad, you can just use your free podcast app, and if you use iTunes on a computer or desktop, you can just search for Coaching for Leaders on iTunes, or if you really want to make it easy on yourself, just go to coachingforleaders.com/iTunes on any device. That will take you right there to leave a rating and review. Thank you in advance if you decide to take a moment to do that. Now, a few more resources from today's show, 2 more resources that are available to you, and especially if you have started listening to the show just recently, thank you if you have, 2 resources that will help you out right away, even before the new year. You may be aware already that you can activate your free Coaching for Leaders membership. And if you haven't done that already, 2 reasons to do that immediately. First of all is you'll get access to my free 10-day audio course that's titled 10 Ways to Empower the People You Lead. It is a great course to start this time of the year because it will give you 10 immediate actions that you can take at the beginning of the year to become a more effective leader. And if you'll give me 10 minutes a day for 10 days, it will help you to get the most immediate practical actions to lead better. It comes as a brief audio to your inbox each day, and it will get you started in the new year to take action. So that'll be one thing you'll get immediately. The other thing I mentioned on last week's episode is I am now publishing a monthly membercast. I talked about the first episode with Mike Birch last week, and the second episode is now posted as well. The second episode is with one of our Academy members, Melanie Jackson, and Melanie is the president and founder of an organization called Virtual Partners Group, and we got together and had a conversation about how she restructured her organization this year from a more traditional management structure into holacracy. And those of you who've been listeners of the show for a bit will remember we had an episode on holacracy earlier this year with Brian Robertson, the founder of holacracy. And Melanie has taken her organization, actually made that transition. 2 reasons you'd want to listen to this membercast. Number one, if you are thinking about making a major change in your organization or changing the structure, especially if you're thinking about changing how your organization is managed and the management structure you're using, even if it's not holacracy specifically, I think you'll really benefit from hearing some of the things that Melanie talks about as the president of an organization, how she navigated that, how she communicated it to her team, and also some of the obstacles she ran into. And the second reason I mention it is I know we have a lot of financial services professionals who listen to the show. Melanie's organization, Virtual Partners Group, if I can say it correctly, does a great job of bringing order and chaos to the back office support for financial services firms and financial advisors specifically. So if you happen to be a financial advisor looking for that, I think you'd also benefit from hearing about Melanie and her organization and getting to know them a bit as well too. So you can get that access to that by going to coachingforleaders.com, setting up your free membership. And for those of you who already have your free membership set up, you can just go to your membership dashboard, click on Membercast, and you will see that episode already posted. It's Membercast number 2. Thanks again, Melanie, for taking the time to share your wisdom with us. I really appreciate it. And a few related episodes that also will come back to today's conversation that'll be helpful to you. Episode number 144, I aired a while back with Kent Rhodes, a friend of Bonnie and mine, who has done some wonderful work on organizational culture and research on organizational culture. We did an episode called How We Do Things Around Here to Get Results. Relates directly to our conversation today. Also, more broadly, talks about how organizations are really changed and interact with cultural dynamics. I think if that's something that's top of mind for you, check out episode 144. Also, episode 154, 8 Ways to Use Power for Good. So we talked about corruption today, but there's lots of ways power can be used for good. Episode 154 is one just with me, where I go through some of the classical types of power that are seen in the research. So that's a good listen if you've not heard it before. Also, episode 254, Use Power for Good and Not Evil. I had Dacher Keltner on the show. He is a professor at Berkeley, also the author of The Power Paradox, a great book that I read earlier this year, and he was on the show earlier this year. And I got to see Dacher speak in person recently. He was fabulous, and I really recommend listening to that episode if you haven't already. So again, that's episode 254. coachingforleaders.com/the episode number is the way to get to all of those. And Bonnie and I are back next week for the very first episode of 2017 with our monthly Q&A show. If you'd like your question to be considered for next week or maybe for a future Q&A show, go to coachingforleaders.com/feedback. That is the best way to get that question to us for consideration. Have a wonderful holiday season, what's left of it. Happy New Year to you, and I look forward to seeing you in 2017. Take care.